Hi, this is Jason Cascarino. Thanks for listening to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of the Remaking Middle School Initiative, whose founding partners include Youth-Nex, the University of Virginia's Center to Promote Effective Youth Development, and the Association for Middle Level Education, or AMLE. You can learn about Remaking Middle School on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Now, here's this episode. Hello and welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we explore the many facets that impact young adolescents in the middle school years, from the adverse to the awkward to the awesome. I'm your host, Jason Cascarino. Today, I talk with three educators working to remake part of the middle grades experience in a Chicago public school through a liberatory design process. Joyce Pae is principal of the Chicago Academy, or TCA, a pre-K through 8th grade school in the northwest side of the city. Oscar Newman is a National Board Certified Science and Math teacher at TCA. Shelby Hildreth is a program designer and coach for the nonprofit AUSL, which is facilitating the Liberatory Design work at TCA. The process works to engage educators to reflect on teaching and learning and school environment and policy to advance equity in deep, specific, and measurable ways.
Many schools engage in this process called strategic planning. And strategic planning is all about identifying root causes. But the liberatory design really centers two additional things. The user, right? So the students themselves and their experiences. And the second thing is equity. So in the past, we've used strategic planning to say, hey, what's not going the way that we want it to? What do we think is the issue? How do we fix the issue? And liberatory design really made us question, is this the actual outcome that we want? How are students experiencing this? And is this perpetuating an inequitable system? And those crucial questions have completely flipped what we're trying to accomplish.
In part one of our conversation, Joyce, Oscar, Shelby, and I talk about the Chicago Academy and the students and community it serves, some of the immediate challenges educators are facing this year as we continue to work through the pandemic, and what the liberatory design process is and the way it's being paired with adolescent development to focus on the middle grades. In part two, we dive deep into the application of the design process at TCA, the specific equity challenges that were identified and addressed through the process, the ways TCA worked to amplify youth voice and test new strategies to better align with adolescent development needs, and how educators across different contexts and environments can utilize liberatory design to address their own challenges. That's in just a bit. Now, here's part one of my interview with Joyce Pae, Oscar Newman, and Shelby Hildreth. Joyce, Oscar, Shelby, I am grateful for your time. It's so nice to get the chance to talk with you. Thanks for joining me. We're going to spend time here talking about the human-centered design work specific to middle grades that you all are engaged in at Chicago Academy, which is a K-8 public school in Chicago on the northwest side of the city. I guess is at Belmont-Cragin?
Yeah, it's on the edge of Belmont-Cragin and Portage Park.
And Portage Park, right, great. But let's start with learning about each of you. Joyce, you are the principal of Chicago Academy. You've been an educator for more than 15 years, by my counts. You've been a teacher, a coach, and a school leader. What was it that drew you to education as a career?
As a career, I was really drawn to education because of my own educational experiences. I grew up in Chicago public schools. I actually attended 3 different CPS elementary schools, 2 different CPS high schools, went through the whole selective enrollment process, went to a magnet school for a little while, things like that. And so from a very early age, I was able to see the difference in the education that I was receiving in different schools. And inherently, I knew there was a difference. I knew that there was a difference between the education I was getting, the education that some of my peers were getting, and I wanted to do something about that. So after graduating from college, I was really set on trying to get back into Chicago public schools to make a difference.
Oscar, you are a classroom science and math teacher at Chicago Academy. You're national board certified. Your undergraduate degree is in anthropology, I read. And when I hear that, I always think I'm talking with someone who has a keen interest in humanity, human development, human interaction, human relationships. Tell me about your journey to education and whether those interests were any influence.
So if you had told a middle school version of Oscar Newman that he would be a science teacher for like the past 25 years, I would not have taken you up on that bet. I memorably spoke with one of my science teachers in high school about dropping out of the chemistry and physics program that I was in because I was going to have nothing to do with math or science after high school. And that didn't work as planned. And, I think part of why I became an educator is that I believe that, like I think a lot of other educators, that education is a vitally important way to make a difference. When I began teaching, I actually began as a day-to-day conditional sub. I found that my educational background had prepared me to teach science, and I found a joy in teaching kids about science and nature that I didn't know that I had in me. But I think it's important that my background gave me some pretty hard-earned insight into what it feels like to be frustrated with science content, especially, what it feels like to be estranged from peers due to race and ethnicity. And here's a metaphor. We are entering into peak bird migration. There are millions of birds representing something like 250 species passing through Chicago right now, but it doesn't always go well. Chicago is in fact one of the most dangerous cities for birds. And this problem exists because of the way that we've chosen to design our urban space. And similarly, schools are places of transition. Students pass through our physical and social spaces on their way to other destinations. And we can design schools that nurture kids and prepare them for their intellectual and social journey, or we can design schools that give new form and expression to alienation and inequity. So that's the choice that we have, and it's an important one.
Shelby, you are also an educator through and through. You've spent many years as a coach. Is coaching and mentoring and supporting the development of educators something you always wanted to do, or was it kind of an organic process moving from the classroom into that role?
Yeah, definitely not something that I always wanted to do. It's really interesting. I come from a family of educators, and I was like, when I was going through college, I said, I'm not going to do that. Clearly that didn't work out because I graduated and I was like, well, I need a job, and got into the classroom and realized, I was like, oh, I got it. I understand why my mom has done this for so long, because I found my place there. And when I moved into working with adults, I think I found kind of a new passion for the work, both in sort of like watching, new teachers in particular kind of learn some of the things that I had learned in working with my students, but also realizing sort of the reach of my impact in being able to coach, teachers over the years, and now work at the school leadership and systems level. It's just been really energizing and fun for me through my career.
So I want to start by painting a picture of the Chicago Academy, if we don't mind. And it's always helpful for our listeners just to be able to paint a mental picture of the setting here. Joyce, I want to hear from both you and Oscar about the experience you're having this year in particular. But before we do that, could you just spend a minute talking about the school generally? Tell us about the community and the students and the families that you serve, and what the middle grades look like, given that you're a K-8 school. How do you structure the learning experience for young adolescents versus the younger children?
First, just some nuts and bolts about Chicago Academy. We are a pre-K to 8th grade school. We have about 540 students currently, 550 roughly. And our population, our demographics, we're very lucky to have such a diverse population of students. In Chicago, you don't find that very often. And so we celebrate the fact that we have a lot of diversity here at our school. That being said, we serve a majority Latinx population of students. We have lots of English language learners who are a mix of Spanish speaking, Polish speaking, although our Polish speaking ELs are kind of diminishing, and our Arabic speaking students are increasing. So we're super proud of the fact that we're a diverse community. It also represents challenges to have 4-year-olds in the same building as 8th graders. That's a very large age span there. And we also are co-located with a high school. So some of our students do their entire pre-K to 12 education in this one building. And while it presents us with some challenges, it also presents us with this amazing opportunity to build this sense of community and just this richness of being able to see our kids grow and graduate multiple times. There's, their kindergarten celebration, their 8th grade graduation, and then we get to see them sometimes graduate from high school as well. This year has been particularly challenging. I think we're all familiar with the national trends of what's going on in schools and the trauma that our students have faced. We are really, really lucky to have the families that we have, to have the staff members that we have that reach out to our families. We found that during our remote learning phase last year, the one kind of silver lining from the all the craziness, everybody saying like this is unprecedented, was that we were able to not only sustain our relationships with families, but in a lot of ways, we were able to connect with them on a completely different level because we were essentially in their homes for a year as we were engaging in remote learning. We learned a lot more about our students. I had a teacher say to me, I am so glad that we got to do remote learning during Ramadan because I could see all the decorations that were up, and that really gave me insight into like, how can we celebrate this, this holiday more for our students, the richness that they saw in the families and their interactions with them, knowing that we were having to reach out more deliberately to engage our families really changed the way that we interacted. So that was the silver lining. And I think that this year, we were all hoping that things would go back to normal and we would slide into this wonderful in-person school year that we had been craving. Unfortunately, we know that there's just a lot of trauma. And because for the past 2 years, our students were largely kept isolated for their own health, that has had outsized impacts on their social development. And we're seeing that now. We are no different than any of the other schools in the country that are facing, issues with students, just anxiety, depression, the peer-to-peer conflicts, the peer-to-adult conflicts that we're seeing have all had just like an exaggerated effect on our students' learning. And we've seen that this year.
Oscar, I'd love to hear from you. How are you doing? How's this year been going? What have you been experiencing?
We're still on the struggle bus, but compared to last year, I'll take this year hands down. It was a real challenge last year to begin the year. Our schedule changed multiple times. It was a variety of different challenges for students. I had a lot of 8th graders who were de facto kindergarten assistants and would have to leave class to prepare meals for their siblings. And some kids were good at communicating those things and some kids felt embarrassed about them. And so there was this real difference in what you're communicating and what you really know about the different experiences for kids. Some kids thrived. It wasn't all bad, to be sure. When we came back to in-person learning bit by bit, those first discussions were essentially like a live action Google Meet in terms of the interactivity. And that was just awkward for everybody. And things are better now. But I think some of that confidence has yet to come back in terms of leading class discussions in the upper grades. That's, an awkward time to begin with. I think I'd also like to just mention that, in this time of the pandemic, when a lot of these other social issues came to a head, it was an opportunity to say, well, if we're going to be going back to the status quo, we need to think about what that status quo is like for all of our students. And the system that had existed previously didn't work for everybody. And so I'd be cautious about what it is that we want to get back to. That being said, this year there are some really amazing things that are happening. Our 8th grade students, for example, when they were in 6th grade, schools shut down the week before a long anticipated overnight trip to the Indiana Dunes National Park. And, they said that this had been stolen from them. We just took that trip last month with them, and it was a highlight of the year. I've done that trip over a dozen times, and this was like the second coldest and rainiest trip. The mud was like Midwest in all of its glory, and we had a blast. That was nice to see. Zero complaints. They were able to socially interact and just have a really good time to do science as well. It's nice to see those kinds of traditional experiences that they had missed that are slow to come back. The assemblies, the field trips, and those things. It's nice to see those starting to come back now.
Shelby, you work across numerous schools and districts, different parts of the country. What have you been witnessing? What has concerned you? What has given you hope?
It's really interesting to hear Joyce and Oscar reflect on this. And I think this is something that I've mentioned to them in the work that we've done over the years, is that story is playing out everywhere. We do work in Texas, we do work in Oklahoma, do work in Reno, Nevada. And I think everybody is trying to navigate sort of how do you reintegrate, folks together while attending to the needs of those individual people and still doing the work of school, right? And trying to figure out how to do that in a way that honors the experiences that people have had, both students and teachers, right? Like we talk about this a lot from the student perspective, which is incredibly important, but teachers have also kind of gone through this unprecedented time too. And we're asking all of these folks to kind of give a lot. And so definitely sort of navigating, competing priorities at the school level, at the district level. There's a lot of funding that's floating around that comes with a lot of requirements that may not make any sense for the populations that we're working with, but schools need access to that. So it's a lot of trying to fit like square peg, round hole type sort of, to make things work. I think the amount of ingenuity and resilience that I've seen in schools and teachers across the country has just been really inspiring around sort of like understanding the importance of this work and really working to just try to find a way to do what's right.
The Chicago Academy has been participating in the Remaking Middle School initiative, which produces this podcast, on what we've been calling middle school redesign. There's a cohort of 4 schools here in Chicago. Chicago Academy is one of them, who are engaged in this work, which is funded in part by the Lefkowski Family Foundation. Shelby, let's talk about the design process first, and then we can get into how it's being applied to the Chicago Academy context and more specifically to the middle grades at Chicago Academy. You at AUSL use a human-centered design process called Liberatory Design. Give us some background on Liberatory Design. How was it developed, and what distinguishes it among the array of design thinking models?
My team at AUSL is the LiberatED Way team, and what we really set out to do was start to think about how do we really design educational experiences for students that empower them to be able to sort of like have experiences to develop skills that are going to allow them to self-determine when they leave school, right? Or whatever path it is that they want to do. And we've learned a lot in terms of school management at AUSL. And I think one of the things that we've learned is the importance of community being a part of that process and how you bring together as many diverse stakeholders as possible to say, what's the vision that we have for students? And let's really drill down on sort of what that looks like. And so in developing kind of that process, we came across Liberatory Design. And so that Liberatory Design came out of Stanford D School and the National Equity Project. And in really starting to think about how do we sort of marry design thinking, which is like, think about your user. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? What are their needs? And equity kind of design, right? When we think about design thinking, if we don't explicitly attend to the experiences of folks, you can recreate a lot of these inequitable experiences unintentionally, right? Like you're well-intentioned in your design, but if you don't sort of peel back the layers around what's happening within the system, you can unintentionally continue to perpetuate inequities across stakeholders. Whereas like when you think about equity design, it can sometimes feel really squishy, right? Around sort of like, what are the metrics? Like, what is it that we're actually trying trying to do? So when we think about liberatory design, it really is kind of finding that sweet spot in between those two. How can we really peel back the layers of all of the pieces of the system and the experiences of all of the folks that are most affected by our decision making, and set up some really clear metrics around sort of like what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And so we settled on this process that we call our LiberatED Way, that is heavily based in liberatory design. And through this process with Remaking Middle School, we've really benefited from the partnership with our friends at UVA in being able to really drill down on sort of like what are some of the early adolescent developmental issues that we would want to attend to, because early adolescents have really unique developmental needs, and being able to sort of incorporate that through this process has been really, really awesome. And so our team goes out and talks to students. We walk classrooms, really trying to get a really clear picture of what's happening within a particular school. And then we bring a diverse group of folks from the team. So we've had a really great partnership with TCA over the past couple of years, and being able to bring together teachers and leaders from all walks of the building to really start to think about what is that picture, and now let's design something around a particular issue that we think is going to really meet the needs of our folks. And TCA has been really great partners because they've done a lot of sort of like trying out things even in between our sessions, which I really appreciate, because that's really what this process is. Because we're constantly getting feedback from the stakeholders across the school to say, like, hey, this is what we're trying to accomplish. Are we making that type of progress? And so it's a much less linear design process, but I think really important in being able to kind of fine tune stuff. And the thing that's really great about liberatory design in this process is you can use it to solve all kinds of challenges. So as we think about how we approach our work, it really is about sustainability and building capacity within leadership teams to be innovative in solving lots of different problems.
That was part one of my interview with Principal Joyce Pae, teacher Oscar Newman, and Liberatory Design facilitator and coach Shelby Hildreth. In part two, we will explore the ways Chicago Academy has used the liberatory design process to improve the learning and overall school experience for young adolescents in the middle grades, how youth lent their own voice to changes being made, and what the design process looks like in a wide variety of contexts and communities. That's in just a moment on the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we feature conversations with researchers, practitioners, program developers, and advocates for young adolescents in the middle school years. Recently, I talked with Clark McCown, president and founder of XL Labs and associate professor of behavioral sciences at Rush University Medical Center. XL Labs conducts an array of research in the education and youth field specific to social and emotional learning, or SEL. Notably, XL Labs also develops assessments for student social and emotional competencies, as well as school climate and SEL for adults. XL Labs is currently building a new set of SEL assessments for middle school age students, which are being designed not only with middle school students in mind, but with their direct input.
With our middle school assessment, we took it up a notch and we said, look, rather than adults in a room dreaming up assessment items and vignettes and stuff, we need to enlist two kinds of input as we build the assessment. One is experts and in adolescent development and assessment, and the other is the best experts, middle school students. We convened a series of focus groups with middle school students and said, hey, here are the things that we want to measure. Can you tell us how relevant these things are to your life and what it looks like for a middle school student, to basically, what does peer pressure look like in middle school? How do you deal with peer pressure? What are the kinds of things that come up? We drafted some items and presented them to them and said, what do you think of these? And some of them would be like, oh yeah, that's on the mark. And some of them, they were like, that never happens. I know what you're getting at, and I can answer the questions, but that's just not a situation that ever happens. We're like, okay, thanks for letting us know. And so we're trying to enlist the diverse groups of youth to help us build the assessments.
You can catch all of my conversation with Clark in a previous episode. And now, returning for part two of my conversation with Joyce Pae, Oscar Newman, and Shelby Hildreth. we often see in the education space a decline in the middle grades of engagement in school that manifests in lots of different ways, whether it comes with attendance or decline in grades, and then the transition to high school is that much more challenging. And our big hypothesis has been that there's a bit of a mismatch between the developmental needs of early adolescents and what they're typically getting in school. So it's interesting to hear you say trying to make the sort of connections through the partnership that you have with University of Virginia, bringing in the adolescent development content and pairing that up with the liberatory design process. Joyce and Oscar, I would love to hear how that's working. What is the situation in Chicago Academy in the middle grades? What were the issues you wanted to tackle? And then talk me through what you've done to address them through the design process.
So what we have focused on at Chicago Academy was we found that when it came to issues with disciplinary referrals that was happening with the upper grade boys in particular, we were concerned, and I think we looked at this question of, is there something wrong with these kids, or is there something wrong with the connection between these kids and school? Is there something wrong with the way that we are presenting school to these kids? And what we decided that we wanted to do was increase student voice and social emotional learning in order to increase the success and satisfaction of those students in particular. But we thought that those benefits would also help other kids. Shelby was talking about these unintentionally replicating inequities, and I think the real challenge that we've had is at what level of abstraction are we talking about making changes? Because if teachers see that we're going to change the way that we do discussions, for example, unless we're really, really explicit about what's going to actually change in terms of your teacher moves in class, what are you going to say differently, there's this strong inertia to keep on doing things the way that you've done it before. There's a strong tendency for people to see these things and be like, oh yeah, I'm doing those things already, and then not take the kinds of actions that are necessary. Inertia is a really powerful thing. If we haven't seen things done a different way as educators, it's difficult to change what we're doing in mid-stride, which is what we're attempting to do here.
Another kind of small silver lining to the pandemic was it gave us a lot of time with distance from behavioral infractions to really think about the data that we were seeing from our students. When you are in the midst of a school year and you see these behaviors that are happening and these conflicts that they're getting into, it's very easy for it to become normalized. And so this is just how things have been. But once we switched to remote and the students were out of the building and we had this mute button, this all-powerful mute button, and we weren't seeing the behaviors, we got a chance to actually think to ourselves, what are we noticing in the behaviors of our middle school students, and how is that behavior trying to communicate a need? And that was a big shift for all of us. So the first thing that we discovered as we were looking at the data, we knew that middle school wasn't working. We knew that middle school had, 6 through 8 had the highest disciplinary infractions in the school. We knew that in particular, our middle school boys were underserved. They were getting the most disciplinary consequences at our school. But we had no idea until we started digging into the data that for one particular class, we had 80% of our disciplinary referrals and disciplinary consequences were 8th grade boys. And so that's really what started to beg the question that Oscar raised. Is this something that's wrong with 8th grade boys? Or is this something wrong with our system? And so last year when we engaged in the initial Remaking Middle School initiative, we really had an opportunity to just dig into data and say, what have we seen historically? And what are we going to say we're going to prioritize? And what Shelby described in the Liberatory Design is so important because, Many schools engage in this process called strategic planning. And strategic planning is all about identifying root causes. But the liberatory design really centers two additional things. The user, right? So the students themselves and their experiences. And the second thing is equity. So in the past, we've used strategic planning to say, hey, what's not going the way that we want it to? What do we think is the issue? How do we fix the issue? And liberatory design really made us question, is this the actual outcome that we want? How are students experiencing this? And is this perpetuating an inequitable system? And those crucial questions have completely flipped what we're trying to accomplish. And I think it's really important to remember the social context of last year as well. With all of the social unrest, we say social unrest, but really with all of the protests that we've seen, all of the marches for Black Lives Matter, it really made us question our own contributions to systems of inequity. And so once we started to do that, there were some really small, easy wins that we knew we could implement right away. We looked at our disciplinary infractions and we said, hey, our female students who are getting referred, what are they getting referred for? Oh, they're getting referred for uniform violations because they're wearing makeup or because we've deemed their skirts too short or we've deemed that they can't wear tank tops and things like that. And we asked ourselves, what is this policy in place for? And if it came down to compliance, that we were perpetuating a system of compliance, then we said, we need to shift this. Because when we look at what's going on, when we looked at this fight for equity and this fight for social justice, compliance is not what we want from our students. We want them to stand up and say, I don't think this is right. And here's what I think we should do instead. And if we are moving towards consistently training our students to be compliance oriented, then we don't create students who are good citizens. We don't advance equity. We don't advance social justice. And we don't get our students to do the things that we really value, which is celebrating diversity. That's part of our core value, and really working to be upstanders in the community.
You just sort of exemplified this disconnect between adolescent development and what was happening in the school in terms of school policy, right? Because you talked about compliance was the school policy. Adolescent development is all about agency. And, I want to govern my own path. And so there's a sort of disconnect there. And so you can kind of see how this sort of process, even from a developmental standpoint, is trying to kind of make those connections better. What so far has clicked? Where have you seen progress, and what just hasn't worked yet, or what have you struggled with?
We wanted to get student voice, and so creating opportunities for students to tell us what they thought about what was going on has been a remarkable thing. Really giving them the chance to speak their minds. And there have been concrete things that happened as a result of that. There are things that we are doing, incentives that we're creating, or programs that we're encouraging teachers to do. I think a challenge there is who is really willing to speak up. What degree of student buy-in is there to changes? And so I think that we really, as we go bit by bit to try and change things, our next move is to really involve parents more and to get their feedback as well.
When I think about the things that we've tried to accomplish, they fall into some specific categories, like the systems. So it was easy when the students weren't here to start trying to pick at our systems a little bit. What are the systems that we have in place that are not serving our students well? So that was the dress code policy. Who does that affect? Oh, that affects the kids. So maybe we should bring in a focus group of kids to help us revise that. What do they think is fair? What do they think is unfair? We went through it, and what we found, they had internalized a lot of these rules and this compliance orientation. And so when we asked them, do you think it's unfair that girls are not able to wear makeup at school? They said, no, that's fine. fine. And then we questioned it a little bit. We helped them to question it by saying, this is labeled as a distraction in the learning environment. Who do you think that it's distracting? And as they thought about it, the only answer was like, oh, do they think we're distracting boys with our makeup? And if that's the case, are we being punished for that? And so walking them through that process was really interesting. And we think that, having those kinds of conversations and helping them to start to question some of the things that they view as like just part of what we do or just established norms is really important. Another thing that I think of that's just a systems thing, we have this rule of being quiet in the hallway. Anytime our middle school students had to go to their lockers, it was always really loud. It was frustrating for teachers. It was frustrating for students. We had these terrible half-size lockers so that kids were literally on top of each other, like one on top of the other. They had to slam them to get them shut because the doors didn't all work. And we said, hey, perhaps the reason why so many kids are getting in trouble is because of the actual equipment we're asking them to use. It's not conducive. The other thing we questioned is, if we don't allow them some points throughout the day to socialize, is that developmentally appropriate for middle school students whom we know crave social interaction and peer interaction and value their peers and are developing aspects of their personality from their social interactions? Like, is this actually contributing to what we want? And is this fulfilling a developmental need? The answer was no. We made a big investment in buying full-size lockers for our students that don't have to be slammed shut, because we realized that that was something that we could do within the environment. That was a structure we could change that would make their day-to-day experience a little bit better and our teachers' day-to-day experience a little bit better as well. So how do we engage them also in some of the other decisions that we're making day to day? If our hypothesis here is like, we need to increase student voice and agency. So we looked for small areas first. The first one was that idea of just discipline, or the dress code. Then we look for things that are critically important to them. Students are definitely going to have an opinion. We were able to send out surveys. We had kids come early to school one day to just sit in an auditorium and rattle off their list. And, the funny thing is, we thought they'd be like outdoor amphitheater, we want to have movies every day. And it wasn't. It was like, can we get some new soccer balls? I really like it if you would fix the basketball hoop that's outside. They were such reasonable requests. And it got us into a conversation of, what do you not like right now? What do you like about recess? And being able to explain to them why we had certain rules in place, like certain restrictions in place because of COVID, how we hope to change them in the future. So it involved them in the process of understanding some of the restrictions that we had to place for their own health and safety, while also saying, hey, we know that you have opinions about this stuff, and we want to make this a better experience for you.
Shelby, when I hear Joyce talk, I hear a lot around this idea of self-reflection or questioning. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? What's the reason behind? A lot of educators listen to this podcast wanting to know, like, if I'm an educator in, say, inner city Baltimore or rural Louisiana or the suburbs of Denver, what is the actual design experience? How do you help educators do this self-reflection, get to the sort of the end user experience? Just describe a little bit of the process for the listeners.
A lot of it is really just holding space. Like, one of the things that I think has been really important about this process is like having dedicated time to bring a diverse group of people together to really ask a lot of questions, right? To ask a lot of questions and dig through data. But it really is sort of like figuring out whose voices aren't represented in decision making and really starting to bring those people together and being able to have conversations about actual experiences. I think one of the other really critical components that has to come right up front is a way to really gather not just quantitative data, but qualitative data. Really gathering qualitative data from the folks that are most affected by decision making and asking really smart questions about their experiences. And then taking the time to really reflect on that. And what's my role, right? Like whatever leadership position I have, what's my role in contributing to that experience? And then using all of that information to start to just brainstorm as many off the wall ideas as possible around starting to think about how do we go beyond what is our current sort of like box of thinking to really start to think about what's in our locus of control for sure, but like how can we really just sort of like flip that on its head, right? Like to really start to think about some out of the box solutions and then taking those solutions back to the folks that you talk to. This is what you said. Here's what we think we're doing. Do you think this is going to work? Would love for you to partner with us. And then testing and doing that sort of like feedback loop cycle all the time, right? Like running through that continuous improvement cycle all the time. Because if you don't take time to kind of stop, pull up and look to say like, are we getting the things that we want? Or are we getting the things that we set out? Or are we addressing the needs that our stakeholder groups told us? You're going to be back in that cycle of like unintentionally perpetuating stuff. I think the other thing that's really, really important about sort of this process is that there really isn't an end point, like because schools in particular change all the time. Every year, the needs are a little bit different because the 8th graders are now going to be gone and you're going to have a new crop of 6th graders, right? You're going to have a new crop of students. You're going to have people transferring in. And so you kind of constantly are in this cycle of testing, feedback, because the needs shift so dramatically from year to year.
Finally, for all three of you, if there is one bit of advice based on your experience with the liberatory design process and teaching and learning in the middle grades that you would offer to educators, both in school and in after school and in summer programs, of things they either ought to know or ought to be doing, what would it be?
Schools are places where, it's all about competing priorities. If you don't give time to space and space for things to happen, they simply won't. Especially things that are hard to do. So thanks, Joyce and Shelby, for facilitating those things and prioritizing those things. Without that leadership, however, it won't happen on its own.
Really being able to have this lofty vision of what could be. And I think it's also important for educators who are listening to this to know that you can start with something that's seemingly very small. And it starts by asking the question, why am I doing this? Or why am I asking? So if students have to sit up and track you while you're walking around the classroom, why am I asking them to do that? How can I make this a more comfortable experience for my kids? I think that everyone can start to question what will work best for students and what is more supportive of students in my own classroom. And those practices, it's been my experience as an educator that when a peer comes up to me and says, hey, I tried this thing and it was really great, it carries a lot more weight than when an administrator comes up and says, hey, we're going to do this thing now as a whole school. And so I think that's just a really easy entry-level thing.
While you may have the best intentions, talk to the people you're making decisions about and for. And on the flip side of that, put away some of your ego around sort of hearing what feedback that may not feel great. Because the only thing, you can't change what already happened. The only thing you can do is figure out, okay, now that I know this, what do I do differently? And I think it really is just being open to that type of reflection and recognizing that regardless of how many degrees we have, how many years we've been in the classroom, how many years we've been in experience, there's always new things to learn about this new population, and always being open to hearing that. And I'm very appreciative of Joyce in this process as the administrator in the school for modeling what that looks like to her teachers, because I think it creates a level of safety for teachers as well to sort of like think about what that looks like. It creates a level of safety for students to be open about their experiences too. So be open, which like sounds really cliche, but it is really one of the most important pieces of this process.
Joyce, Oscar, Shelby, this has been just such a valuable conversation. It's a delight to hear directly from educators and those who support them in schools. It's real, it's tough, but it's also inspiring and reassuring that folks like you are supporting the learning and development of young adolescents in these uncommon times. So thanks for sharing your experience with us. That was Principal Joyce Pae and science and math teacher Oscar Newman of the Chicago Academy and Shelby Hildreth of AUSL. You can follow TCA on the web at chicagoacademy.org, and you can follow AUSL online at auslchicago.org or on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at AUSL Chicago. Thanks for joining the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of Remaking Middle School, an initiative that seeks to transform the learning and development experience for young adolescents in the middle school years. Remaking Middle School brings together good educational practice in school and out of school with the latest developmental science. You can learn about Remaking Middle School or find more resources about the topics of this podcast on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Or learn more about the founding partner organizations, the University of Virginia's Youth-Nex Center on the web at education.virginia.edu/youth-nex, N-E-X, or on Twitter at youth_nex, and the Association for Middle Level Education on the web at amle.org or on Twitter at AMLE. The Lessons in Adolescence podcast is produced by Abby Gillespie and me, Jason Cascarino, editing by Paige Waterhouse. You can listen to or download each episode at the Remaking Middle School website, on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.